Welcome to Windows on the World. Yes, we're having another Corbyn chicken coup update in the interests of the public and to counter the BBC bias. I'm here with Piers Corbyn and he's got some updates for us.
Okay, well, continuing. The attempted coup against my brother is failing. Jeremy is winning and winning and winning, despite the Blairite side trying every trick in and out of the book. But do not rest there, because they will try more. First of all, Jeremy's rallies have been stupendous. In Liverpool, for example, he had a rally of 20,000, whereas Owen Smith had a rally of approximately 100, and he was trying to give away free ice cream at the same time. And this is happening across the country, like in Cornwall, in the north of England, in Wales, everywhere. Now, the campaign itself has turned into a kind of mini general election, which I think is really good, because it shows that Jeremy and his campaign can actually get across to a really wide layer, and that is actually what worries the Blairites, because they don't want that. They don't want those policies to win, because they want the policies of privatisation, which they gain from personally. They want those to carry on. And if you think about it, it's pretty obvious that a lot of Conservative voters, they're not necessarily unreasonable people or anything. They have a slightly different view of the world. But most of them also want a fairer society. Now, what Jeremy is saying is that we cannot go on with a situation where the rich just get richer and richer and the poor get poorer and poorer. And a lot of people who vote Conservative also know that. And they can also see that it's only Jeremy under this democratic, fair-minded Labour Party which can actually combat that. So, I urge you to stick with Jeremy and convince other people who aren't with the Labour Party that this is the way forward for Britain. Because there isn't any other way other than continual undermining of the living standards of the great mass of people. So stay there. Thank you.
It may appear that in mainstream media you may not be able to use the term Blairite anymore. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, well, I have heard that, yes. Which is quite astounding, because, it says that Blairite is an insult.
But is it surprising with the amount of control that's being applied to this? It's not really, is it? I mean, no. The whole thing has become ridiculous. And what's been interesting about these short sections we've done is you're outlining really how ridiculous the whole thing is. But also the tactics that are being used are dirty tricks tactics that are now exposed and in full public view, which is why I'm finding it very interesting.
Yes. Well, I agree with you. Now, I don't use the word Blairite in Twitter, for example, but because of this. But you think about it, that's ridiculous. Well, I mean, it's just a word which describes a group. Look, if we'd had an election in the Tory party where a great swathe of them were told, even after they joined, they wouldn't be allowed to vote, Owen Smith and all his mates would be up in arms about the undemocratic Tory party. But they're busy doing this sort of stuff in the Labour Party. So, it's unbelievable what the media allow people like Owen Smith to get away with.
Well, we've been talking about this today, and the PR that journalists spout, that they're just being given by news agencies or whoever. There's no investigation, there's no original thought going on here, and there's no real analysis. But when analysis was done, it was found out that 75% of stories were just opinion pieces against your brother. That's why I keep reiterating it's interesting, because we've now got the whole thing exposed, and really there's one agenda being played out, and your brother is the only antidote to that agenda, and that agenda's pretty frightening, isn't it?
Well, it is very frightening, because opinion is used as a substitute for fact all the time, and all the questions posed by the BBC are very ideologically loaded. and people are corralled into a certain way of thinking. And this applies also on the issues of climate change and science, where again the whole media machine is used to regiment people behind a exploitation and in fact a privatisation agenda, essentially in the interests of Wall Street capital. I mean that is the way things are going, because they are desperately short of profit. Now, there's only one answer, which is to stand up against them.
Exactly. Now, there's something that was very interesting on the BBC news page, was this story of this Australian guy in Parliament, the Senate, and he was saying that the climate change agenda was a UN plan, which it is, as we know, under Agenda 2030.
Right.
Now, the BBC not only called him a climate change denier, but also linked him to being anti-Semitic. So they got everything in the same sentence. The only thing they didn't use was the word Nazi or fascist.
Yeah. Well, of course, the BBC there's a series of standard labels which are whacked against anybody who they don't agree with. One of them is anti-Semitic. Another one is racist. They are used in contexts where, under normal use of English, they just don't apply. But they are kind of bad words to make people look bad. And I think everyone needs to worry about the manipulation of English language. Now, George Orwell warned us of this, of course. The concept of newspeak is about social control. And we have to rely not on opinions, obviously we have opinions, but in the end we have to rely on facts. What are the economic facts? What are the scientific facts? What are the economic results against what is claimed? I mean, for example, the Tory Blairites were saying more and more people would become owner-occupiers. Well, actually, that isn't happening, because they've meddled around with profits in the property market so much it's become impossible. But there's a whole lot of things like that. We should, under a modern society of increased technological power, actually have everybody getting more wealthy. But in fact, the relative wealth and absolute wealth of a lot of people is going down.
Exactly, the population is being impoverished, and basically aspirations are being lowered. But just to come back to that story, it was Malcolm Roberts, and it says here, this is of the BBC News, one of Australia's new senators has said climate change is a global conspiracy created by bankers seeking to establish a worldwide government. Well, most people know that already, right?
This is true, but you see, the word conspiracy is put there to make it sound untrue. But look, if you want to argue about it, any you and I talking about, well, are we going to have a cup of tea or not? I mean, that could be a conspiracy. It's just about common sense agreements between groups of the same interest. It's absolutely true. The UN does have an agenda of forcing through the climate change idea, and they originally wanted to make money out of it by carbon trading.
Exactly.
The Americans, in the form of Al Gore, stepped in and stopped that so they could make the money themselves.
Yes.
And of course now the whole shooting match is collapsing because people can see it's not true, and the carbon trading hasn't taken off in the way they thought. But nevertheless, they're still going to milk the carbon con to the bitter end.
Well, exactly. There's a lot of money involved, and there's been a 30 years planning going on with this stuff, really, hasn't there, at least?
No.
It says here, he says the United Nations is using climate change to lay the foundations for an unelected global government. Well, we know that the UN are an unelected global government, right? That's the whole point of the UN, is that they are an unelected global government.
Yeah, that's right. They are. But of course, see, I mean, if you want to go into the details, that's what they want. There's a certain bureaucracy in there which wants that. But the Americans don't want that, because they want to carry on the control. They want to control the UN. And of course they do, basically, through funding or not funding and stuff like that. So it's interesting, but the Americans do want the CO2 con, because it can maintain oil prices and control people in all sorts of other ways. And why Hillary Clinton and Obama are totally, absolutely obsessed with it. Although the fact is, it is a pack of lies. And if you recall, on the 16th of May, at a big meeting in Imperial College, I specifically challenged Professor Sir Brian Hoskins to come forth with some actual evidence which showed that there was data, in historical data of the world, that carbon dioxide changes preceded changes in temperature. And he has still not come forth with that data. Now, any theory to be true, that theory in particular, requires such data, and no such data exists. And he's a top climate scientist, and if such data exists, he must be able to produce it.
Exactly. And I think that what this guy's done is incredibly interesting. Malcolm Roberts has put in an affidavit to the government stating all this stuff as fact.
Yeah.
And an affidavit, unless it's rebutted, stands as fact. And this is an antidote to what the IPCC are doing with their fraudulent data, because an unrebutted affidavit would actually usurp all this nonsense in a court of law if it was allowed to get there, which brings us to what we were going to talk about in this section, because we've got a conference coming up in London.
We have.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
That's right. Well, it's an important climate change conference, subtitled The Dawn of Truth, where we're going to go into what does actually cause climate change and extreme weather events, and a lot of what we do in weather action is exactly about that, and also expose the CO2 con. And this is part of actually a political agenda. So we are combating the establishment in academia and politics. Now, what we're going to say at this conference will, we hope, have certain impact on the rank and file politically, where as is well known, a lot of young people believe that man-made climate change is caused by bad capitalism, and therefore they should do all these recycling things. Well, okay, I mean, recycling is common sense. You know, we can do all these things. Biodiversity is common sense. We can back biodiversity, but we don't need to straitjacket ourselves with something which is false in order to carry out good things. So anyone who believes in green policies, I'll say, look, carry on with the greenness, but do not get drawn into the CO2 con, which is just making you pay more money for electricity and making more money for other people, as well as, of course, killing birds in the form of wind farms and so on. So we want real green policies, not this nonsense which in the end is put there to exploit you.
Exactly. And just getting back to Malcolm Roberts, what he said, this is brilliant, because the BBC are stating what is fact as though it's some kind of wild conspiracy, but it's actually quite a good piece for people to read this. It carries on. The UN IPCC's unfounded core claim about human CO2 is part of UN Agenda 21 campaign for global governments, the report said. This is his report. A 135-page appendix to the report, Mr. Roberts wrote in detail about his belief that an international cabal of bankers is exercising enormous influence on world affairs. Now, who could actually deny that that was true?
Well, they have conferences every year, don't they, in Davos or whatever, you know. I mean, of course.
He says
it goes on. A conspiracy or not? Well,
it goes on with
the secret, aren't they? You know, I mean, come on.
Cognitive dissonance carries on. The report says the US Federal Reserve and Bank of England are privately controlled corporations, which is what they are exactly, and that their owners are seeking to introduce carbon trading into the world economy as a way to generate money and extend their control. Well, which part of that isn't true?
Well, that is well, they've said that. They've said that, and they've been asking people to invest in carbon trading. I mean, come on, this is fact.
And then we get to the money shot with the BBC. It says it also lists Holocaust denier and conspiracy theorist Eustace Mullins as a primary reference. Well, Eustace Mullins' book was about how the Federal Reserve was set up. That was his most famous book. So thank you, BBC, for your enormous bias and your increasing stupidity in the face of facts.